Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. Oliver's hands trembled as he closed the door behind him, the quiet click of stark contrast to the chaos brewing in his mind. His world had been small and safe until tonight. Until he stumbled upon the shattering truth. A crumpled invitation lay on the table, its embossed gold letters stark against the dark wood. He picked it up again, as though hoping it would read differently this time, but the words remained the same, an invitation to the society's gathering, followed by the date and location of a luxurious country mansion. Tonight's destination, the society, a circle of wealth and power that he had never been invited to join, or even suspected his wife was involved with. Yet here, on the guest list, were two familiar names, Laura Mason and Zach Warren. His wife Lara and her lover. Together, they were at this event under the glow of chandeliers and discreet whispers, sharing secrets with the man who ruled over them all, Robert, CEO and master manipulator, the one who allowed their affair to flourish under his very watch. And every name on that list would regret tonight. Oliver exhaled slowly, releasing years of bottled humiliation and quiet betrayal. All those quiet nights Lara spent with friends, his growing suspicions, and her deflective reassurances were finally stripped bare. Tonight, he would be there too, but not as an invited guest. This time, Oliver held the power. With a final glance at the invitation, he slipped it into his pocket, grabbed the small flash drive from the table, and headed for the door, his path lit not by rage alone, but by a grim sense of satisfaction. Each step toward the mansion felt like shedding a part of his old life. His patience had run out, and tonight, everyone would pay. The mansion loomed ahead, its towering facade alive with shadows cast by decorative lights set into the ornate stonework. Laughter, muffled and mingling with the low thrum of music, floated out from the open windows. The wealth, power, and privilege radiating from the scene could have felt intoxicating to anyone outside looking in. But to Oliver, it felt like stepping into a war zone. He slowed his steps as he neared the entrance, slipping into the shadows. He watched the guests arriving, each one stepping out of glossy cars, dressed in gleaming outfits, and greeted by waitstaff who whisked them inside without question. Somewhere in the throng of well-dressed bodies, he caught a glimpse of Laura's familiar silhouette, her laughter blending in with the murmurs and clinking glasses. Lara's arm was linked through Zach's. They moved with ease, their bodies swaying slightly in sync, the electric charge between them visible even at a distance. To the guests around them, they were just two more glamorous faces, unaware of how dangerously entangled they were. A flash of anger sharpened Oliver's resolve. He clenched the small case in his hand a little tighter. It contained his meticulously gathered evidence, photos, transcripts, bank records, and a few damning videos that no one in this society would ever want the public to see. Inside the mansion, the air was thick with expensive perfume and hushed secrets. The walls themselves seemed to shimmer under dim chandeliers that cast a decadent glow over the room, giving every surface a polished, indulgent sheen. Oliver entered quietly, slipping among the crowd unnoticed, keeping to the edges where shadows masked him. His gaze locked on Lara and Zach as they joined Robert at the far end of the grand hall. Robert was laughing, his deep voice booming over the chatter. Handsome and self-assured, the CEO moved with the kind of authority that convinced people he was untouchable. For a moment, Robert glanced toward the crowd, and Oliver thought he saw a flicker of recognition in the man's eyes. But Robert's gaze moved on quickly, oblivious to the carefully woven net tightening around him and his guests. The evening progressed, and as Oliver made his way closer to the center of the room, He noticed the shifts in the crowd. People laughed a little too loudly, glanced over their shoulders a bit too often, as if sensing an uninvited tension. He knew he didn't have much time before whispers started to ripple, and he needed every person in this room to be both witness and audience. At last, as the music softened, Oliver stepped forward, and the room fell into an uncertain hush. Eyes turned his way, some of them with polite curiosity, others with mild irritation. But when Lara saw him, her expression turned cold, and he could see the panic flicker in her eyes. Zach followed her gaze, his face twisting into a defiant sneer. Oliver held up his hand, cutting through the silence. "I came here tonight," he began, his voice steady, "because I've learned that secrets have a way of catching up to those who think themselves safe." He held up the flash drive. "On this drive, I have everything. The names, the details, the accounts that show what you all have been hiding. Lies, betrayal, and corruption. All of it." A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. Robert's smile faded, replaced by a wary glance toward Lara and Zach, as if trying to gauge their involvement. Lara's face paled, but her chin lifted, as if daring him to say more. Zach's smirk had all but vanished, replaced by something darker. A flash of fear he tried to mask with a steely glare.
"Taking in their expressions?"
Oliver let a small smile play at the edge of his lips. "So, before you all think about silencing me, just know that this isn't only about Lara or Zach. This is about every last one of you who thought your dirty little secrets were safe." He turned, leaving the flash drive on the table and stepping back into the shadows as murmurs turned into panicked whispers. Satisfaction filled him as he made his way to the exit, watching the ripples of fear spread through the crowd like cracks in a flawless facade. This was only the beginning, and he intended to watch every piece of their lives crumble, one secret at a time. The doors to the mansion swung shut behind Oliver, but inside, a storm of shock and confusion erupted among the guests. At first, the crowd hovered in stunned silence, absorbing his parting words. They were frozen in place, glancing at one another with wide eyes, as though expecting someone to laugh, to call it a joke. But the tension thickened as they realized it wasn't a prank or an idle threat. Lara's hand trembled as she reached for her champagne glass, but her usual poise was gone. She glanced at Robert, searching for some cue, a signal that would assure her he had the situation under control. Yet, Robert's confident demeanor was unraveling. His jaw clenched, his gaze narrowing on the small flash drive Oliver had left on the table, its presence an unmistakable threat. Even from a distance, the object seemed to radiate with the weight of every dark secret stored within it. What was that?" a woman murmured, her eyes darting between Robert and Lara. Her voice trembled, breaking the room's tense silence. "It's nothing," Robert replied, but the usual smoothness in his voice wavered. Just a pathetic display of desperation. He glanced toward his assistant, a man named Colin, who immediately went to collect the flash drive, but his movements betrayed the urgency and fear simmering just beneath the surface. Zach, too, was losing his composure. He turned to Lara, hissing under his breath. "What the hell was that all about? Is he bluffing?" His face had lost its usual smugness, his eyes darting nervously between her and Robert. Lara swallowed hard, trying to mask her own panic. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely steady, "but whatever he has, he can't do anything to us." She sounded more as if she was trying to convince herself than Zach. Still, the guests around them overheard enough to pick up the thread of betrayal. A murmur of gossip began to ripple outward, creeping across the grand room like a spreading wildfire. At the center of it all, Robert remained coldly defiant. But beneath his facade, a deep unease had begun to fester. The CEO prided himself on his control. He was the one who orchestrated deals, who protected his circle's reputation and secrets, ensuring that nothing left the polished walls of their elite gatherings. This was a sanctuary for people like him, where their money, influence, and carefully guarded friendships insulated them from scrutiny. But tonight, that fortress was under siege. As the guests pressed closer, Robert lifted his hands to silence the room, but his eyes betrayed a hint of strain. "Enough. We'll handle this," he said, his voice carrying authority, though cracks of doubt showed at the edges. Oliver Mason is a bitter man looking to settle personal grievances. Whatever he claims to know, it will go nowhere. Now let's not entertain his theatrics any further. Yet his words rang hollow. Eyes lingered on Lara and Zach, and the room buzzed with low, uneasy voices. Whispers turned into demands for explanations, for assurances. Robert, ever the commanding presence, met each gaze with steely calm, yet he could feel his grip on the situation slipping. Colin returned with the flash drive, but when he whispered something to Robert, the CEO's face darkened. "Enough," Robert commanded again, but his voice had grown sharper. "We'll sort out this nonsense. Go. Enjoy yourselves. You are here to relax, not to be rattled by a bitter man's theatrics." But it was too late. Rumors began twisting and multiplying with each whisper. Suddenly, names were floating through the crowd, past rumors resurrected and given new weight. People stepped back, glancing at one another with suspicion, each wondering who among them might have made themselves vulnerable to Oliver's threats. If Oliver really did have evidence on Robert, Lara, Zach, who was to say he didn't have something on everyone else? Lara tried to laugh, shaking her head as if to dismiss it all, but her voice faltered. The crowd that had once embraced her with admiration now observed her with suspicion. In a single night, Oliver had cracked the foundation of their perfect world, and no one knew if it would hold. As Robert turned to his closest associates, gathering them for an emergency meeting away from prying eyes, he realized that he was no longer in control. Oliver had planted a seed of distrust that was quickly blooming into full-blown panic, and for the first time, Robert tasted a bitter truth. Their secrets had become a threat, and Oliver Mason had unleashed a reckoning that none of them could stop. The emergency meeting took place in a private study just off the main hall, a room paneled in dark mahogany and filled with dimly glowing sconces that added to the room's oppressive atmosphere. Robert, Lara, Zach, and a few others close to the inner circle gathered around, each looking increasingly tense as they took in the CEO's simmering anger. Robert began pacing, his fingers clenched around the flash drive. The stakes of this threat were higher than any of them were willing to admit. "Does anyone know exactly how much Oliver could have on us?" he demanded, his gaze cutting sharply to Lara and Zach. "What has he seen? How long has he known?" Lara, attempting to keep her voice steady, replied, "Robert, Oliver is just lashing out. He doesn't have the power to ruin us. This is a desperate attempt to make us panic." She shot a look at Zach, who was already sweating under the pressure, but Zach wasn't as composed. "Are you kidding? He showed up here with this." He pointed at the flash drive. "He looked too confident, Robert. This isn't just some jealous husband. He planned this." Robert turned the drive over in his hands, considering its implications. As the CEO of a powerful company, he was accustomed to managing secrets, his own and those of everyone in his inner circle. But the specifics of what Oliver might have collected sent a dark ripple through him. What if Oliver's leverage was enough to truly damage them? He took a breath, his voice dropping lower. "Lara," he said, a touch of accusation in his tone. "This is more than just lashing out. You should have handled this, contained it." Lara opened her mouth to respond, but he cut her off. "And you, Zach, should have been more careful. It's not as if this could have been hidden forever." Laura bristled at his tone, her pride wounded. "Don't you dare blame this all on us. You were the one who encouraged us to live a little, who assured us that we were untouchable." Her voice held a note of bitterness, one that she hadn't dared let slip before. But tonight, The delicate balance of loyalty and control was tilting, and she could feel the distance widening between her and Robert. The others in the room shifted uncomfortably. They were mostly silent, but Oliver's revelation had stirred old tensions, breathing life into hidden grievances that had never surfaced before. Robert's control was slipping, and the confidence he used to wield like a weapon was failing him. Robert looked at each of them, irritation flashing in his eyes. "You all forget what's at stake here. It's not just about one man's revenge or a few indiscretions. If Oliver has what he claims to have, we're all compromised. We're talking about exposure that could ruin us all." There was a momentary silence, the weight of his words settling heavily over the group. Lara, though visibly anxious, kept her tone sharp. "Then we get it back from him. We convince him this won't end well for him if he pursues it." She seemed almost eager, her jaw set in determination. "We've kept things under wraps before. We can do it again." But Zach wasn't so certain. He swallowed, his hand brushing his forehead. "And if we can't get it back, if he's already shared it with someone else?" His voice carried a hint of panic, and it was clear that the thought of losing control over the situation terrified him. One of Robert's closest advisors, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "Look, if he's already leaked any of this information to someone on the outside, the fallout could start within hours. Oliver didn't come here alone. He came prepared. This was an attack." His voice lowered. "He's no fool." At this, Robert's expression hardened. He moved toward the desk, placing the flash drive down as though it might burn his hand. "Then we play defense," he said, his tone sharp and resolute. "I'll make calls. We'll bring in people who can manage this situation quietly. But in the meantime," his gaze fixed pointedly on Lara and Zach, "we need to be airtight. No more mistakes. From now on, every move is calculated." Lara and Zach nodded, though it was clear that the confidence they once held was slipping away. Robert's authority, though still powerful, felt more like a thin veil hiding the cracks that had started to appear among them. For the first time, the people in this room felt vulnerable, each one of them aware that Oliver's attack was more than a minor disruption. It was a carefully aimed blow that had found its mark. Robert clenched his jaw, realizing that Oliver had them cornered. This was no mere intrusion. Oliver had begun his destruction from the inside out, and none of them could guess what might come next. As Robert's emergency meeting dragged on in tense whispers, the atmosphere in the mansion had shifted. The guests who had initially laughed and sipped champagne in ignorant bliss now exchanged anxious glances. Every pocket of conversation was laced with suspicion, as if each person feared they, too, might be exposed by whatever dark knowledge Oliver Mason had hinted at. What had once been a night of opulence and indulgence had become a simmering pot of unspoken fears and barely concealed tension. Some guests clustered by the grand windows, staring out as if Oliver might still be lurking in the shadows outside. Others murmured among themselves, scrutinizing each face around them, as if trying to divine who might be implicated in the secrets he had alluded to. A few tried to carry on with the party, attempting light-hearted banter that fell flat as their laughter came off sharp and hollow. One man, an investor who had made his fortune in questionable deals overseas, was visibly nervous, wiping his hands repeatedly with a linen napkin. He glanced around with wild, darting eyes, muttering under his breath about people who don't know how to keep private matters private. He caught the attention of a group nearby, and they watched him with raised eyebrows, wondering what skeletons were rattling in his closet. In another corner, a glamorous socialite whispered to her friend, her manicured fingers gripping her champagne flute tightly. "Do you think he meant us?" she asked, her voice laced with panic. Her friend tried to comfort her with a forced smile, yet she too kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting Oliver to reappear with accusations in hand. But amid the growing paranoia, Lara was the center of the most cutting whispers. As word of her connection to Oliver leaked out, guests began piecing together their own sordid theories. For years, she had commanded attention and admiration among these people, her flawless image of charm and allure making her a fixture in Robert's elite circle. But tonight, her carefully built persona was fraying at the edges. The thin cracks that Oliver had exposed were spreading, and even her closest friends were now keeping their distance, whispering behind her back. Zach, standing near the back of the room, could feel eyes on him, too. The usual arrogance he carried, the smug confidence he wore like armor, had disappeared. People looked at him with raised brows and averted gazes, as if he were already tainted by his connection to Laura and her husband's retaliation. He could see their judgments in every glance, every whisper. In the society that prized discretion and loyalty, his involvement in an affair that had gone so far off the rails was no longer a thrill. It was a liability. Robert, still sequestered in the study, remained oblivious to the full extent of the growing chaos outside. His closest advisors clustered around him, strategizing ways to contain the threat, as one of them put it, while others urgently made phone calls to private security contacts. One even suggested reaching out to certain overseas contacts who specialized in quieter means of resolution, a thought that Robert didn't reject outright. This circle of wealth had always known that their secrets were their only true currency. If Oliver's threat was real, then every effort would be taken to ensure that he and anyone else aware of the scandal was silenced. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside the study, a small group of guests listened at the door, straining to catch fragments of Robert's conversation. One of them, a shrewd banker with a history of backdoor dealings, whispered to his companions, "If Robert's involved, we're all in danger. He wouldn't scramble like this unless he was afraid. You all saw his face." The others nodded, nervous, and one of them muttered, "We have to cover our own tracks. We're on our own here." The words carried weight, sinking into each listener's mind. For years, they had trusted Robert's iron grip to shield them, his influence to protect them from consequences. But in that moment, as they heard the panicked voices in the study, the extent of their vulnerability dawned on them. They had all assumed they were untouchable, but Oliver's threats and Robert's reaction had shattered that illusion. Back in the main hall, Lara could sense the whispers grew louder. The crowd now divided into isolated pockets, each group eyeing the others with wary suspicion. It was clear that everyone present had something to hide. Each guest wondered if they too might be on Oliver's list, the next secret to be revealed. Lara, clutching her empty glass, looked around at what had once been her kingdom, a court of admirers and allies. But all she saw now were wary strangers, each distancing themselves as if proximity to her alone might ruin them. Zach approached her, his face pale. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Lara's eyes hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She had lost so much tonight, and in her desperation, her mind was whirring with potential escapes. She knew, however, that any attempt to restore her image would mean confronting Oliver, and she would have to do so carefully, because now her reputation was in ruins. As the night dragged on, the crowd dispersed in waves, each departure marked by sidelong glances and tense handshakes. Those remaining were the boldest or the most terrified, lingering to see if Robert would somehow salvage this night. But each of them, Lara and Zach included, knew that Oliver's shadow had stretched over them all, leaving a stain they could never fully erase. The last of the guests began filtering out, leaving the once grand party room hollow and tense. Robert's close circle stayed behind, gathering in a tight, grim group as they watched the doors close on the final guest. Only Robert, Laura, Zach, and a few select associates now remained, the silence thickening around them like a shroud. Robert, visibly fuming, poured himself a scotch and took a long, measured sip, as if the burn might ignite a plan. He turned to Colin, his assistant, who had been analyzing the flash drive, eyes narrowing. "Well?" Robert's voice was low, but filled with a cold fury. Colin cleared his throat, his face ashen as he looked up. It's bad, Robert, he admitted reluctantly. Oliver's been documenting everything for months. He has financial records, personal bank transfers, even some receipts from company funds that, he hesitated, glancing at the others, that could easily be traced to this circle. His voice trailed off under the weight of his boss's steely gaze. Robert's expression darkened. So you're telling me he has leverage against everyone here? His voice was cold, each word a controlled hiss. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze landing hardest on Lara and Zach. Lara shifted uncomfortably, no longer able to meet his gaze. She had always prided herself on keeping her affair hidden in plain sight, confident that her charisma and Robert's protection would keep her safe. But Oliver had shattered that illusion, unearthing her deepest secrets and threatening to expose them to the world. As if sensing her thoughts, Zach spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. What if we just make him disappear? No evidence, no one to talk. He glanced around the room, his expression both desperate and calculating. Robert's face remained impassive, though his lips tightened in thought. Do you even understand who we're dealing with, Zach? He replied sharply. Oliver has outmaneuvered us at every turn. You think he hasn't prepared for the worst? That he hasn't safeguarded that information with multiple fail-safes? Zach's face paled, but Lara's expression hardened. Then we need to negotiate, she said firmly, her voice cutting through the silence. Find out what he wants, buy his silence. We've paid people off before. She looked at Robert, her gaze pleading. We can find a way out of this. But Robert shook his head. You don't negotiate with a man who's already burned the bridges. You think he wants money? This isn't just about revenge, Lara. He's willing to take us all down because he doesn't care about the cost to himself. One of Robert's other associates, a lawyer named Grant, shifted uneasily. If he releases even a fraction of that information, it won't just be reputations at stake. We're looking at legal consequences, prison for some of us. The weight of Grant's words settled on everyone, sinking in as the reality of the situation became clear. What had started as a scandal, a betrayal between husband and wife, was spiraling into a full-blown crisis that could tear down everything they had spent years building. Robert's grip on his glass tightened, and he set it down with a sharp clink, his gaze dark and resolute. Oliver wants us to panic, and it's working, he muttered, almost to himself. But he wants to see us suffer. He wants us to unravel, to turn on each other. He glanced around, studying each face in the room with a calculating look. Lara clenched her fists, her anger sparking as she met Robert's eyes. So what are you suggesting, Robert? That we just sit back and let him control us? Her voice was barely above a whisper, but each word dripped with frustration. Robert took a slow breath, his mind racing with options. We regroup. We prepare for the worst-case scenario and minimize the fallout. I'll have our PR team craft a plan to counter any leaks, and Colin will comb through every record Oliver might have gotten his hands on. And if we have to start scrubbing records and erasing traces, then that's what we'll do. The room fell silent, each of them absorbing the implications of Robert's plan. It was desperate, a gamble with high stakes, but in the absence of a safer option, they had no choice but to place their trust in him. Zach broke the silence. And what about Oliver himself? We can't just ignore him. He's foolish enough to think he can destroy us without consequences. He'll learn soon enough. He may not be able to silence him, but we can make sure he's got nowhere to hide. His life will become as miserable and chaotic as he's made ours. We'll see how long he holds his ground then. Robert's eyes glinted with a dark resolve, the relish still small in his mind. There is still some living chaotic hope to be caught here. His life will become as miserable and chaotic as he's made ours. We'll see how long he holds on to us. Ooh, he muttered. No shred. The others exchanged wary glances, a mixture of dread and determination passing through the group. They could sense that they were crossing a line they'd never be able to uncross. But Robert's ruthless plan was their only hope of survival. As the tension thickened, Robert glanced back at the empty room where the party had taken place, his mind already strategizing the next steps. If Oliver wanted a war, Robert was willing to meet him blow for blow, but the question lingered, unspoken among them. Just how far were they all willing to go to protect their lives and their secrets? As the hours crept toward dawn, the mansion was nearly silent. Robert's close circle, exhausted from the night's tension, had retreated to separate rooms to strategize in small, hushed groups. The weight of Oliver's revelations hung over them all like a dark cloud, each of them wrestling with their own anxieties and suspicions. Lara paced in one of the guest rooms, her mind racing. For years, she had carefully curated her life, maintaining an image of grace and control. Her affair with Zach had felt like a harmless indulgence, a hidden thrill that no one would ever discover. She'd assumed Oliver was too passive to do anything about it, that his suspicions were simply misguided jealousy. But now, standing in the cold light of what Oliver had unleashed, she was realizing just how deeply she'd underestimated him. Her betrayal had been the spark, and now Oliver was ready to let it burn them all to the ground. The door creaked open, and Zach stepped in, looking as frayed as she felt. His once confident smirk was gone, replaced by a tight expression of worry. "They're talking about contingency plans," he muttered, nodding toward the hallway where Robert and his advisors were gathered. "Robert's already calling in favors. He has people looking into Oliver's background, trying to find weaknesses." Lara nodded, though she was far from reassured. She'd known Robert long enough to recognize when he was on edge, and tonight was no exception. Despite his show of strength in the meeting, she could tell he was reeling, struggling to contain the mess that had erupted in their midst. Robert's confidence was his power. The cracks in it tonight were enough to leave her feeling exposed and vulnerable. "I don't know if any of this will work," she whispered, almost to herself. "Oliver isn't just some upset husband anymore. He's different, determined. He's willing to risk everything to see us fall." Zach crossed his arms, glancing uneasily at her. "Then maybe we need to handle this on our own terms," he said, his voice a mixture of bitterness and fear. "If Robert's plan doesn't work, we're the ones left holding the pieces. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." Lara's gaze hardened, a flicker of anger sparking in her eyes. "You think I don't know that?" she shot back. "This is happening because we—" She stopped herself, softening her tone. "Because I let this go too far. But I'm not going to let Oliver ruin everything I've worked for." For the first time that night, a trace of her old confidence returned. She was Lara Mason, after all. She had always found ways to control the situation, to turn things to her advantage. This would be no different. She reached out, taking Zach's hand in a grip that was more steel than warmth. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "We stick together. We know each other's secrets. We know what's at stake, and we know what we're capable of. If Robert's plan fails, we'll figure something out ourselves." Zach nodded, though his eyes held a glint of doubt. Their partnership had always been a risky one, built on a thrill that seemed so harmless in the shadows of their hidden meetings. But now, with their secrets exposed, it felt like standing on a crumbling ledge, the ground shifting beneath them. Outside the room, Robert's voice carried through the hall, low and commanding as he issued instructions over the phone. He was relentless, his plans sprawling from quick fixes to long-term strategies, but there was an air of desperation to his orders. It was as though he was fighting against an unseen tide, struggling to hold back a force that was steadily eroding his empire. Lara listened intently, catching fragments of his conversation. She picked up on words like crisis management, media blackout, and damage control. It was clear that Robert intended to mobilize his resources to cover up or even destroy any trace of the scandal that could threaten their reputations. But she also knew that if Oliver had indeed safeguarded his information as Robert feared, any attempts to silence him might only trigger further ruin. As dawn's first light filtered through the curtains, a sense of dread weighed down on everyone. They were caught in a web of lies and leverage, and no matter how much power and influence they wielded, there was a limit to what they could contain. Robert finally ended his call, standing alone for a moment, shoulders sagging as if the fight had drained him. He glanced toward the room where Laura and Zach stood, his eyes meeting Laura's for a long, tense moment. There was no hostility, but there was no warmth either, only a shared recognition of the peril they faced and the choices they would soon have to make. Robert approached them, his voice low but resolute. "If Oliver thinks he's going to bring us down, he's got another thing coming. We've survived worse, and we'll survive this." His words were firm, but his eyes betrayed a shadow of doubt. "But understand this," he added, looking at each of them in turn. "If I find out anyone's loyalty wavers, they're going down with him." With that, he turned, disappearing down the corridor, leaving Lara and Zach standing in the quiet aftermath of his words. They both understood that from this moment on, every move they made would determine their survival. And in the silence that followed, a chilling realization settled between them. Oliver's vengeance was no longer a distant threat. It was a fire, ignited and spreading, and they were all trapped within its path. As the first rays of dawn cast a dim light over the mansion, Oliver stood outside, hidden from view, watching his plan unfold from a distance. His anger, once a raw and consuming force, had sharpened into something cold and calculated. The scene within the mansion, which had been the pinnacle of exclusivity and privilege, was now unraveling into a hive of fear and paranoia, a fortress crumbling from the inside out. He imagined the chaos inside. Robert, the unshakable CEO, likely barking orders and scrambling to contain the scandal that had taken root in his carefully constructed empire. Laura, so poised and self-assured, would be reeling from the blow to her pride, aware now of the depth of her misjudgment. And Zach, stripped of his cocky bravado, was probably clinging to whatever semblance of control he could muster. A man who had underestimated the price of his thrill-seeking. A wave of satisfaction washed over Oliver. His message was clear. They could hide no longer. Every clandestine meeting, every whispered confession, every betrayal was now in his hands. These were people who had played games with other people's lives, believing themselves untouchable. Yet here they were, spiraling into panic and suspicion, their bonds of loyalty fraying with every passing second. From where he stood, Oliver took out his phone, opening the secure file he had prepared. The file contained every piece of information he had managed to gather. Evidence of financial schemes, secret transfers, infidelities, and hidden alliances. Over the past few months, he had traced the steps of each member of Robert's circle, uncovering the sordid details they thought were buried. He had created this web of damning secrets meticulously, each piece precisely recorded and crucially shared with trusted third parties to ensure that any attempt to silence him would be futile. The thrill of retribution quickened his pulse, but he forced himself to stay calm, to think ahead. He had already sent a small, controlled leak to a prominent investigative journalist, a trusted contact who was itching to expose the hidden lives of the elite. He could almost see the headline, "Secrets of the Inner Circle Unveiled, Power, Betrayal, and Lies." But that was only the beginning. Oliver had made sure that each of them, Robert, Laura, Zach, and even those on the periphery of their elite group, was entangled in the potential fallout. With a sense of finality, he tapped out a message to the journalist, "Ready when you are." He pressed send, knowing that the wheels he had set in motion were beyond stopping. This scandal would unravel at a relentless pace, spreading through the media, legal channels, and private circles like wildfire. Inside the mansion, Robert was piecing together the first glimpses of the damage, his phone lighting up with urgent texts and calls from his contacts. Each message brought worse news. Rumors were spreading, and the media had already caught wind of a scandal involving several high-profile figures. He was bombarded with questions and demands for statements, his fortress of silence crumbling. His attempts to shut it down were proving futile. The information was out there, and it was growing beyond his control. As the morning progressed, whispers turned into accusations. Robert's inner circle began to splinter. The desperation in their voices unmistakable. Friends became liabilities. Allies turned on each other, each one searching for a way out of the impending ruin. Laura was cornered by several former friends, her explanations falling flat, her usual charm failing her in the face of their palpable distrust. Zach was no better off. Colleagues who had once admired him now viewed him as a risk, someone who might drag them down in his disgrace. From his vantage point, Oliver allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The very people who had thrived on deception were now caught in the web of their own secrets. The tables had turned, and he was watching as each of them tasted the betrayal they had inflicted on others. It was a moment he had waited for, and it was unfolding just as he'd envisioned, a carefully planned dismantling of their power, their relationships, their lives. Then, without another look back, Oliver turned and walked away from the mansion, leaving it and its occupants to the chaos he had unleashed. He had no intention of going into hiding, no plans to flee. He would stay, watching the pieces fall, prepared to face whatever repercussions might come his way. But he doubted they would be able to touch him. His defenses were airtight, and his allies prepared. He knew they would try to retaliate, but they were already weakened, struggling to save themselves from the mess he had left in his wake. As he disappeared into the early morning fog, Oliver felt a calm he hadn't experienced in years. This was his final act, his ultimate statement, against those who had wronged him and believed they could get away with it. They would never forget this night, and neither would he. It was a victory not just for himself, but for everyone whose lives they had carelessly trampled. In the end, Oliver had done more than expose a few secrets. He had dismantled an empire built on lies, leaving each of them to grapple with the fallout on their own. And as the morning sun began to rise, the world they had known, built so meticulously on wealth and influence, was irrevocably changed. They were left only with fear, regret, and the memory of a quiet man who had decided that, for once, he would not be silent.